A flight across the Atlantic was scrapped within hours, and almost nobody outside Washington fully grasped why. The Vice President of the United States was supposed to touch down in Switzerland to advance one of the most delicate diplomatic efforts of the year. Instead, his plane stayed on the tarmac, his schedule was wiped clean, and a fragile peace process suddenly looked like it was coming apart in real time. The public explanation was vague, citing unresolved logistics. The real story was bombs falling over southern Lebanon. This is the story of how a single night of violence in the Middle East froze a delicate negotiation between Washington and Tehran, and why the aftershocks of that night are still shaping decisions inside the White House right now. It began with a ceasefire that was never as solid as it appeared on paper. After a costly and brutal war between Israel and Iran, the two sides signed a tentative framework, a 14-point memorandum of understanding meant to wind down hostilities and open a 60-day window for deeper talks. On the surface, it was sold as a diplomatic breakthrough. Behind closed doors, officials on both sides understood the real test wouldn't come in a conference room, but on the ground in Lebanon. That test came overnight. Israel says a Hezbollah explosive device struck one of its tanks, killing 4 soldiers, including a lieutenant colonel, with more wounded in a follow-up drone strike. Israel answered with a wave of airstrikes across southern Lebanon. Lebanese health officials reported at least 16 to 18 people killed before sunrise, making it one of the deadliest nights for Israeli troops since the broader war had supposedly wound down. For Iran, that overnight escalation became the perfect leverage point. A senior diplomat told international reporters that Tehran was now demanding guarantees that the fighting in Lebanon would stop before its negotiators would even return to the table with the Americans. That single demand was enough to collapse the opening round of talks scheduled in Switzerland, the very meeting the vice president had been preparing to attend in person. But here's the part most headlines glossed over. The Lebanon clause wasn't a footnote in this agreement. It was written into the very first line of the memorandum, a commitment that all parties would respect Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Iran was leaning on a promise the United States itself had put in writing, and that single sentence had become the most fragile hinge in the entire deal. So why does this matter beyond one canceled flight? Because the location alone tells you how seriously this negotiation was being treated. The talks were set for a lakeside resort in the Swiss Alps, the kind of quiet, neutral ground nations picked specifically to keep domestic political noise out of the room. Postponing it wasn't a scheduling hiccup. It was a signal that the entire 60-day clock on this agreement was now in jeopardy before it had even started ticking. The diplomatic strain didn't stop at the postponed meeting. It spilled directly into a public rift between Washington and its closest Middle East ally. As criticism of the agreement grew louder inside Israel's own government, the vice president pushed back in unusually blunt terms, arguing that a nation of 9 million people cannot resolve every national security threat through military force alone, and challenging critics to offer a workable alternative instead. That remark landed like a shockwave in Jerusalem. Hardline members of Israel's cabinet had already been attacking the deal as a dangerous concession to Tehran. Now they were being publicly lectured by Washington's own vice president, a moment several analysts described as Iran achieving a strategic objective without lifting a finger, by driving a visible wedge between the United States and Israel. Israeli officials argue they're operating in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods on earth, and that deterrence against groups like Hezbollah can't simply pause because a memorandum was signed in Washington. Critics counter that continued strikes risk torching the very ceasefire framework Israel itself agreed to. Both arguments can't be fully right at once, and that contradiction is exactly what stalled the talks. Money quickly became the second flashpoint. Reports surfaced of a possible reconstruction and investment fund tied to the broader deal, with figures circulating in the hundreds of billions of dollars, financed primarily through Gulf state partners rather than direct American taxpayer money. The vice president insisted Iran would receive, in his words, $0 directly from the United States, and that any financial benefit was strictly conditional on full compliance with new nuclear restrictions. Several Republican senators weren't convinced by that framing. Their argument was simple. Even if no check is written by the U.S. Treasury, lifting sanctions, unfreezing assets, and opening the door to wider oil sales still functions as an economic windfall for a regime Washington has spent decades trying to isolate. One senior Republican lawmaker reportedly compared the scale of the potential package to dwarfing the controversial 2015 nuclear agreement struck under the previous Democratic administration, a comparison clearly meant to sting inside a party that spent a decade campaigning against that very deal. What happened next surprised even seasoned Iran watchers. Iran's supreme leader, who hadn't appeared publicly since being wounded earlier in the conflict, issued a written statement through state media, appearing to authorize his officials to continue direct talks with American negotiators while adding a pointed caveat. Sitting at the table did not mean accepting what he called the enemy's position. He went further, suggesting the American president had only agreed to this framework out of desperation rather than strength. That single line complicated the narrative coming out of Washington, where officials had been framing the agreement as a position of overwhelming American leverage, following months of military pressure on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Behind the headlines was another story entirely, one involving military spending. New reporting indicated the Pentagon was requesting close to $80 billion to cover costs tied to the conflict, alongside other unrelated budget pressures, according to officials briefing lawmakers privately. The defense secretary was also publicly scolding NATO allies for what he called shameful hesitation during the war, while confirming a 6-month review of American troop levels across Europe, including possible cuts to fighter jets, reconnaissance assets, and naval deployments. Few people noticed what happened on the domestic political front afterward. Multiple Democratic lawmakers, including a Marine Corps veteran on the Armed Services Committee, called for the defense secretary's resignation, with some pushing for an investigation tied to a controversial airstrike that Iranian officials claimed killed well over 100 people at a school facility. The administration largely brushed the criticism aside, but inside Republican foreign policy circles, a quieter debate was happening. Some conservatives who originally backed military action against Iran were now privately asking what the conflict had actually accomplished, especially as the emerging deal appeared to walk back several harder-line positions the administration had championed just months earlier. So who actually benefits from where things stand right now? Iran walks away with sanctions relief, expanded oil access, and a powerful new bargaining chip in Lebanon, all without formally abandoning its ballistic missile program or its support for regional proxy groups. Israel is left managing an active military front largely on its own, while publicly absorbing criticism from its most important ally. And the administration is caught defending a deal that even members of its own party are calling weaker than the one it once campaigned against. The official narrative describes this as diplomacy from a position of strength. The reality on the ground in southern Lebanon, measured in soldiers killed, airstrikes launched, and a vice president's canceled flight, tells a far more uncertain story. What happens next depends on whether Washington can pressure Israel into de-escalating without triggering a collapse inside its own governing coalition, and whether Tehran's negotiators return to the table believing they've already extracted real concessions before formal talks even resume. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a single night of strikes in Lebanon was enough to freeze high-level talks between two nations that had just signed a historic memorandum, how stable can this entire framework really be over the next 60 days?